they didn't even wait for the meeting to end. One moment I was presenting quarterly compliance metrics, my usual dry territory of numbers, regulations, and cross-referenced files, and the next, the head of legal, flanked by 2 HR representatives, stood and read a prepared statement in a room that suddenly felt too quiet. My breath caught in my throat when I heard the words, serious breach of protocol, revoked federal funding, and worst of all, termination effective immediately. I didn't look at the faces around me. I couldn't. But I heard the shuffle of pens dropping, the sharp inhale from someone near the projector screen, and the sound of Dr. Lena Caraway's heels tapping a little too slowly as she leaned back in her chair, expression unreadable. She'd been promoted just 2 weeks earlier, supposedly for leadership excellence. I wondered then if she had known this was coming. The $9 million grant had been the cornerstone of our immunotherapy trials, cutting-edge, high-risk research under a federal biosciences program. Losing it was catastrophic, but the implication that it was my fault, that was something else entirely. I had reviewed that protocol a dozen times. Triple-checked every timeline and signature. But they accused me of falsifying a compliance log and failing to report a Phase 2 incident. Both charges would never survive a full audit, if anyone cared to look. I had given 16 years to ArdenPath Biomedical. I had written the very training manual these HR reps were now waving in front of me, justifying my dismissal. Yet in less than 3 minutes, they erased my name from the company with surgical precision. No one asked for my version. I stood without speaking, my hands numb, my throat dry. I didn't cry. Not then. Not even as I walked back to my office through a hallway that had always felt like home. Colleagues avoided my gaze. A few looked startled. One woman from accounting, who'd once shared photos of her wedding dress with me in the break room, gave me a faint, pitying smile before disappearing around the corner. Back in my office, I closed the blinds before sinking into my chair. The termination letter trembled in my lap, but it wasn't fear that made my hands shake. It was something colder. Sharper. Humiliation. Rage. And beneath that, something quieter still, betrayal. Not long ago, ArdenPath had been a place of mission and meaning. When I joined in 2009, we were 25 people in a converted clinic space with dreams bigger than our grant budgets. We believed in discovery. In integrity. In doing the kind of research that made lives better, not richer. That ended when Havex Scientific, a private biotech conglomerate, acquired us last fall. Their reps showed up in tailored suits and started replacing our laminated lab safety signs with glossy marketing posters overnight. Dr. Simone Braithwaite, the founder who had built ArdenPath from nothing, was pushed into retirement with a smile and a severance check. Soon after, internal structures started shifting. Quietly. Systematically. Departments merged. Key personnel were replaced. And clinical compliance, the department I led, was placed under the purview of Integrated Risk Oversight, a new Havex unit with no background in biomedical ethics. But I didn't complain. I adjusted. I took notes. Every deviation. Every unusual meeting. Every time someone tried to rush a trial clearance without the right documentation. I wasn't planning revenge. I was just trying to protect what little integrity remained. But now, with my badge deactivated and security waiting outside my door, I knew I was the next loose end they wanted to cut. And they chose the most public, dehumanizing way to do it. Still, I didn't rush. I removed a small USB drive from behind the lining of my desk drawer, one I had never connected to my work laptop. I quietly transferred my own performance records, time-stamped audits, and full documentation of regulatory submissions I had personally filed. I had nothing to hide. And more importantly, I had something they hadn't anticipated, meticulous notes. For years, I had kept a private compliance log, one that tracked inconsistencies, internal overrides, even shadow approvals for trial extensions that had never passed ethics committee review. It had started as a way to protect myself from errors, to document oversight when systems failed. Now it was a lifeline. I copied the file to the drive, encrypted it, and slid it into the lining of my wallet. Then I sent a single, silent email to my personal account, confirm. Full package. No attachments. No explanation. Just a subject line I had built a filter for, months ago. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, tempted to send one more message, to a colleague, to a friend, maybe even to Dr. Caraway, but I stopped myself. Whatever came next had to be deliberate. Controlled. I had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went, but I wouldn't survive it by being reactive. I gathered the framed photo of my niece from my desk, slid my planner into my bag, and turned off the small orchid light on the windowsill. It had bloomed 2 weeks ago, during the long weekend I'd worked through, finalizing our Phase 3 filing. It felt like a cruel joke now. The HR rep met me outside the door, offering a faint, uncomfortable nod. "We'll escort you out," she said. I nodded back, saying nothing. As the elevator doors closed behind us, I caught a final glimpse of Arden Patha's mission statement in raised silver lettering on the wall. Science, truth, humanity. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the truth had just been buried 6 floors below, and I was the only one holding a map. Let them think they had one. Let them think I would go quietly. I had 16 years' worth of knowledge in my head, 16 years of truth buried beneath their paperwork, and now, nothing left to lose. And I intended to make every second of that count. It started with a single discrepancy, one that I shouldn't have been able to access. 2 days after my termination, I logged into an old virtual compliance mirror I had built for redundancy years ago. It wasn't connected to Arden Patha's mainframe anymore, not since Havex overhauled our architecture. But I had kept the structure active on a cloud cache, more out of habit than foresight. A digital ghost town of old logs, document version histories, and time-stamped backups. Nothing that could compromise security. Just echoes. Or so I thought. The first thing I noticed was a revision timestamp on a quarterly compliance report. It bore my credentials. My login signature. But the date didn't match. I was on medical leave that week, recovering from a minor surgery. I remembered because I had spent those slow days obsessively reorganizing my spice rack and answering wellness check-ins from coworkers. I had definitely not logged into our clinical trial database. Yet there it was. An edited record, dated and logged under my name. A full audit trail that claimed I had reviewed and approved a Phase 2 safety waiver for trial series H8X-D7. Except, I never touched that trial. And I had never approved that waiver. I opened more files. Looked deeper. At first, it felt like picking a scab, small, manageable pain with familiar rules. But the deeper I went, the more I realized the wound was festering beneath the surface. Someone had been using my digital identity to rewrite the past. Not just one file. Dozens. Ethics reports showing no adverse events, despite what I now confirmed were hospitalization records buried in subappendices. Progress memos noting accelerated subject recruitment, but omitting the waiver approvals that should have come from the internal review board. Even email trails, automatically generated compliance summaries, that bore my name but none of my words. This was not a clerical error. It was a surgical rewrite. And someone had gone to great lengths to make it look legitimate. A week earlier, I would have confronted the issue through internal channels. Spoken to risk oversight. Gathered my evidence like a good soldier and waited for the system to do its job. But that system had already turned on me. I couldn't unsee what I now understood. I had been removed not because I failed, but because I noticed. And someone didn't want me watching anymore. It didn't take long to connect the digital trails to the new chain of command. Specifically, to Dr. Lena Caraway. Lena had been a research fellow when I first met her, brilliant, detail-oriented, and quietly ambitious. She'd arrived from a pharmaceutical think tank in Europe with glowing recommendations and a carefully cultivated sense of modesty. The kind of person who asked the right questions, but rarely offered too many answers. When Havex took over, she was one of the first promoted. I found her name on every expedited protocol approval for the last 6 months. She'd greenlit high-risk immunotherapy trials without independent safety verification. Her signature was attached to 3 altered incident reports where trial participants experienced adverse neurological symptoms, but no regulatory filings were ever made. There were emails too. Internal ones, not directed to me but copied on group threads I had archived. Lena pressing project managers for faster trial progression. Using phrases like strategic acceleration and risk mitigation through narrative management. It was corporate speak dressed as scientific urgency, but I knew what it meant. They were fast-tracking treatments, skipping safety protocols, and falsifying results to keep the grant pipeline flowing. Only now the grant had been revoked, the program under scrutiny, and I had been offered up as the reason why. A scapegoat to satisfy federal inquiry. A sacrifice to buy time. I stared at my screen for a long time that night. Not crying. Not shaking. Just absorbing. Lena Caraway wasn't incompetent. She was calculated. And I was done playing their silent accomplice. The next morning, I submitted a formal report to the Federal Research Oversight Bureau. It was 61 pages long, complete with appendices, timeline reconstructions, metadata analysis, and a list of forged digital approvals using my credentials. I filed it under whistleblower protections, anonymized by default, but I knew eventually my name would surface. Then I filed a second complaint with the Ethics Division of the National Science Consortium. This one was more personal. Less data, more testimony. I explained how years of slowly shifting standards, of optimizing, compliance, and streamlining protocol, had created the perfect conditions for systemic fraud. I didn't ask them to punish anyone. I asked them to protect the science. After submitting, I stepped away from the computer and walked outside. It was spring. Too bright for what I'd just done. My hands ached from typing. My throat felt sore from the silence I had kept too long. I sat on the edge of a stone fountain at the corner of Hennepin and 12th, where pigeons cooed and bus brakes hissed in the distance, and for the first time since my dismissal, I felt something return to my body. Not peace. But clarity. I wasn't fighting for myself anymore. Not for my title. Not for my record. I was fighting because no one else had. Because someone had to say no. That afternoon, I received a generic confirmation from the Bureau, standard language, auto-reply, barely human. But buried in the consortium's message was a name I recognized, Dr. Simone Braithwaite. She had been copied on the review committee notice. Retired founder. Advisory emeritus. Still holding enough influence to raise questions in the right places. It gave me hope. A fragile thread, but one I clung to. The truth was now out there, formal, time-stamped, legally admissible. It would take weeks for anything to surface publicly. Months before the first real questions were asked. But a clock had started ticking. And Mira Langston, forgotten, discarded, erased, had just become the one holding the detonator. The email that changed everything came with no subject line. It simply read, Dr. Caraway has been placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. You will be contacted by the Ethics Review Board for a formal statement. Be advised, your prior documentation has prompted a Category 2 inquiry. I stared at it for a long time, barely blinking. It was the first official acknowledgement I'd received. No apologies. No vindication. But it confirmed what I already knew, someone had finally started paying attention. The dominoes were beginning to fall. Over the following days, I watched from the outside as Ardenpath Biomedical, once a modest research institute, now a gutted trophy of corporate ambition, began to hemorrhage credibility. The Federal Research Oversight Bureau had quietly flagged the H8XD7 trial as compromised. The National Science Consortium listed it under urgent revalidation, pending audit. But what struck me most was what didn't happen. No press releases. No public denials. Just a cold, coordinated silence from HAVEX. Then, 3 days later, I received a call from a private number. I almost didn't answer. Ms. Langston. The voice was composed but warm. This is Dr. Simone Braithwaite. I believe we need to speak. We met at a quiet garden cafe just outside the city, the kind of place that served chamomile in real teapots and still had cloth napkins. Simone arrived precisely on time, elegant as ever in a slate gray coat and silver scarf. I had studied her work in grad school, clinical ethics, patient agency, regulatory frameworks built not around policy, but principle. I had always admired her from a distance. Now she was looking at me like an equal. I've read your report, she said, folding her hands. And I read between the lines. Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't even surprised. It was tired. The kind of tired that comes from watching something you love be corrupted from within. I fought to keep Ardenpath focused on science, she said. But the moment we took HAVEX's offer, I knew what we'd become, data manufacturers for profit pipelines. I nodded slowly. They blamed me for the grant collapse. She looked at me with something like sorrow. Of course they did. But the truth is more damaging than any procedural mistake. I reached into my bag and handed her a printed dossier. The grant wasn't revoked due to misfiled safety protocols, I said. It was pulled after the reviewing body flagged inconsistencies in reported trial data. Someone altered results to mask adverse effects in the H8XD7 trial. And you can prove it. I already have. Simone's expression didn't change, but her silence said everything. She read through the first few pages. Her hands didn't shake, but I saw the faint tension in her jawline, the slight hardening of her mouth. When she spoke again, her voice was clear. You need to testify. My stomach turned. Before the consortium. She nodded. And likely before Congress. This is bigger than Ardenpath. If HAVEX manipulated clinical data to sustain grant flow, it violates multiple federal statutes. They'll need a witness with first-hand knowledge. I felt my pulse slow, not with fear, but with weight. This wasn't about clearing my name anymore. This was about becoming a voice that couldn't be silenced. A week later, I stood in front of a review panel at the National Science Consortium, flanked by 2 ethics observers and a federal liaison. I spoke calmly, precisely. I outlined what I had seen, what I had documented. I submitted digital logs, email chains, authentication forensics. I answered questions not as a disgruntled former employee, but as someone who still believed that science had to mean something. They didn't interrupt. They didn't challenge. They simply listened. By the end of the week, Dr. Caraway had not only been suspended, she began cooperating. Pressure worked quickly once the fabric of a lie began to unravel. Lena admitted to approving falsified reports under direction from HAVEX's executive compliance strategist. She claimed she'd been threatened with demotion if she didn't ensure grant continuity. Emails backed up her claim, but they didn't absolve her. She wasn't the architect. But she'd helped paint the walls. Soon, more executives were pulled into the investigation. HAVEX's CFO was subpoenaed for correspondence regarding discretionary spending tied to trial management acceleration. Ardenpath's interim director abruptly resigned. And suddenly, people remembered my name again. I received 5 calls in 2 days. One from a science journal. 2 from ethics oversight firms. 1 from the regional news outlet that had buried a glowing profile of me just a year earlier. And the last? From the University of Northbridge. The voice on the other end was confident, but humble. "We've followed the investigation closely. And frankly, we believe you represent the kind of ethical clarity this field desperately needs. We're launching a new research integrity and compliance program. Would you consider leading it?" For the first time in months, I allowed myself to exhale. Not in relief, but in release. 16 years of diligence, sacrifice, late nights. 16 years of being invisible until I became a problem. And now, at last, someone wasn't asking me to shrink or disappear. They were asking me to lead. The congressional hearing was scheduled soon after. I was escorted into a wood-paneled room, cameras watching, microphones waiting. I wasn't a political actor. I didn't have sound bites or slogans. But I had data. And I had the truth. I explained how easy it was to manipulate compliance when systems prioritized speed over scrutiny. How corporate incentives quietly eroded ethical review structures. How people like me, people with institutional memory and the courage to question, were pushed out to make room for silence. After I finished, the chairwoman leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "Ms. Langston," she said. "Some have called what you've done courageous. Others, disruptive. What do you call it?" I thought for a moment. "I call it necessary." The session ended in applause, not thunderous, but sincere. And when I walked out of that building, I felt the weight begin to lift. Not because the fight was over. But because I was no longer alone in it. I declined their offer without hesitation. A carefully worded letter from the new board at Arden Path arrived 2 weeks after the hearings, inviting me to return as their Senior Director of Compliance and Ethics. The language was respectful, almost deferential. They expressed profound regret over the way my dismissal had been handled. They assured me that the prior leadership was gone, and that the lab was undergoing a full reform audit. They needed someone to help rebuild. To restore credibility. But I had already given Arden Path 16 years. I wasn't going back to live in the ruins of someone else's recklessness. I offered a counterproposal. I would serve as an independent external advisor during their recovery process, with full oversight access, executive reporting privileges, and most importantly, zero administrative subordination to HAVEX or its subsidiaries. I expected them to balk. They didn't. They agreed to every term. Within days, Arden Path released a formal statement, one vetted and edited by me, acknowledging the mishandling of compliance protocols, the use of falsified data, and the unjustified termination of Mira Langston. My name. In full. In print. Not hidden in a footnote, not buried behind legalese. They didn't use the word scapegoat, but everyone understood. I watched the press conference from my apartment, coffee cooling in my hand, as Arden Path's new interim director, a former NIH auditor named Clarice Thoma, read the apology line by line. "We acknowledge that ethical safeguards failed. We acknowledge that due process was not afforded to Ms. Langston. And we acknowledge that without her persistence, these failures would have gone unchecked." It was a strange moment. Not triumphant. Not vindicating. Just, still. As if the world had finally gone quiet enough for the truth to breathe. The headlines followed within hours. HAVEX under federal investigation following whistleblower allegations. Falsified trial data triggers $14 million fine for HAVEX subsidiary. Langston named advisor in industry-wide reform initiative. I didn't enjoy watching HAVEX crumble. I didn't need them to suffer. But I did take satisfaction in watching the veil drop. It wasn't just Arden Path that changed. Within weeks, other research labs across the country began re-examining their compliance protocols. Medical journals issued preemptive retractions on papers where HAVEX funding had been involved. Private biotech firms began introducing Langston clauses in their ethics agreements, language specifically protecting internal whistleblowers and outlining procedures for anonymous audit triggers. The ripple effect was subtle but wide. Where once I had been quietly removed from the table, now I was being asked to design the table itself. At Arden Path, my work as an advisor wasn't symbolic. I rebuilt their reporting infrastructure from the ground up. We implemented dual authentication logs for every compliance approval. Introduced third-party validators for Phase 2 and 3 trials. Required that all executive decisions affecting research direction be co-signed by independent ethics consultants. And the biggest change? Every compliance officer, from junior staff to clinical leads, now reported to an independent ethics board, not to the CEO. It was a structural firewall I had fought for years to establish. And now, no one dared argue. Not after what they'd seen. The research community, once hesitant to speak my name in professional circles, now cited my reports in seminars, in white papers, even in training modules. Ethics summits invited me as a keynote speaker. Not for spectacle. For guidance. I was no longer the woman who got fired for a lost grant. I was the one who reminded them what science owed the public. And still, I kept my distance from ceremony. I declined awards. I avoided interviews unless they served a functional purpose. My goal was never to become a symbol. Symbols are too easy to ignore once the story fades. What I wanted was permanence. Change baked into policy. Protection made systemic. Accountability not just written, but enforced. During one of my review visits to Arden Path, a young researcher stopped me outside the elevator. She looked nervous, like she was rehearsing something she'd debated saying all morning. "I just wanted to thank you," she said. "For not staying quiet. For making it possible to question things again." I nodded, unsure what to say. But the moment stayed with me. That was the real legacy. Not the headlines. Not the panels or the policies. But the quiet space it created, for others to speak. For the first time in my career, people weren't afraid to raise their hand and say, "This doesn't feel right." By summer, I had finalized my agreement with the University of Northbridge. The title was long, Director of Ethical Resilience and Research Oversight, but the mission was simple: train the next generation to do what I had done, without waiting until it broke them. And as I looked out from my new office window, surrounded by stacks of curriculum drafts and case studies, I knew this was what I was meant to do all along. I wasn't returning to anything. I was building forward. The auditorium lights dimmed, leaving only the soft golden glow of the stage spotlights and the steady hum of anticipation that always precedes a moment of meaning. It had been exactly 1 year since I was asked to leave a room in shame. Now I was being asked to speak. The University of Northbridge Annual Ethics Symposium had filled every seat. Students, researchers, policy experts. A few former colleagues. Even 2 journalists I recognized from the early days of the investigation sat quietly in the back row, notebooks closed, eyes forward. I stepped up to the podium and let the silence linger. Not because I needed dramatic effect. But because silence, real, considered silence, was a luxury few people had allowed me in the months when truth first began to unfurl. Then I spoke. Not about the scandal, or the firings, or the fines. Not about the headlines or the people who once whispered my name like a cautionary tale. I spoke about resilience. Not the kind that bears wounds and keeps walking. But the kind that says no when everyone else says go along. The kind that rebuilds without bitterness. That leads without permission. That refuses to give up on truth, even after being punished for defending it. When I finished, the room stood. Not in thunderous applause, but in quiet affirmation. A stillness more profound than noise. Afterward, a young man approached me near the stage. I recognized him immediately, Caleb Stone, one of my trainees from years ago. Back when Ardenpath still believed compliance meant conscience, not just code. "I'm in the Graduate Ethics Fellowship now," he said. "That's largely because of what happened with you. And because of how you responded to it." He paused. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to be my mentor." I smiled, not politely, not professionally, but genuinely. "Yes," I said. Because that was the point, wasn't it? Not to rebuild a reputation, but to pass forward the strength it took to survive without losing yourself. Ardenpath had changed. Not fully. Not forever. But enough. It was smaller now. Leaner. Many of the Havoc's fingerprints had been scrubbed from its infrastructure. Legal action was ongoing. Several executives now faced federal charges, and Havoc's stock had plummeted in the wake of regulatory sanctions. But beyond punishment, something else had taken root. Transparency. Compliance meetings were now public record. Trial participants had expanded rights to data access. Researchers could flag concerns anonymously, and without fear. The systems weren't perfect. But they were human again. Dr. Lena Caraway had disappeared from the public eye. Last I heard, her license had been suspended. She had returned to private life, far from laboratories and litigation. I felt no joy in her fall. Only quiet recognition of the cost of staying silent for too long. As for me, I never went back to being the woman who kept her head down in meetings. Who smoothed over friction in the name of efficiency. Who took pride in being invisible, because it meant being trusted. That kind of loyalty doesn't serve truth. It only serves comfort. Now, my name appeared on ethics reform proposals, new federal oversight recommendations, even published papers that redefined what it meant to build scientific systems that couldn't be so easily hijacked by ambition. The idea that we must choose between integrity and innovation. I had disproven it. I kept one framed photograph on my office wall, not of the symposium, or my congressional testimony, or the new program at Northbridge. It was a copy of the old Ardenpath mission plaque, Science. Truth. Humanity. The irony used to make me flinch. Now, it made me proud.